I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about ADHD and the somber subject of suicide. For someone who has ADHD compared to someone in the general population who have ADHD, your likelihood of dying from suicide is about, or your relative risk is about 2 to 6 times higher than someone in the general population. At least in the US, which has a moderately high rate of suicide, only about 1% of people die from it. So the majority of people with ADHD, even if they're 2, 3, maybe 6 times more likely, the vast majority are not killing themselves. But this is, again, a substantial cause of death. We've talked before that those with ADHD, on average, diagnosis of ADHD in childhood live about 10 years shorter, lifespans about 10 years shorter than their non-ADHD peers. And at least half of that seems to be due to accidental causes, but almost the other half seems to be attributable to suicide in many studies. Important part of the take-home message is for years there's been a pretty contentious debate as to whether this increased rate of suicide in those with ADHD was completely attributable to confounding factors such as higher rates of depression, anxiety disorder, substance abuse. And I think my reading of the data is pretty clear that there are enough well-done, rigorously controlled studies suggesting there is a substantial component that is purely coming from ADHD and not from associated comorbidities. My reading of the data, and some of this, I'll try to be clear where we have hard data and where I'm speculating, but I think I'm right with my speculations. So what I think is important and that is widely understudied in the suicidality research area is impulsivity. I think it is an important contributor to suicidality in those with ADHD, and I think at least in some of those without ADHD, it's a under-recognized or under-accepted form, maybe particularly for younger people. Jumping into the data, what do we see? We see that whatever age group we look at, and the ADHD research world is much more fragmented than most other mental health. So if we're looking at depression, most of the studies are looking at depression across the lifespan. But with ADHD, they're sort of broken down by age group. So we have research on ADHD and suicidality in children. We have research on ADHD and suicidality in teenagers or adolescents. We have research on suicide and ADHD in college students. We have research on ADHD and suicide in adults. Every single age group, all of them find there have been isolated, I would argue, poorly done studies that didn't find it, but pretty much this at least twofold to those sixfold increase in suicide. And I'm here talking completed suicides, whatever age range, if you have ADHD. Suicide is still a fairly rare event, and in kids, it's a less than 1 out of a million event. Great that it's so rare, horrible that it happens to anybody. It's hard to study rare events. So there is research on suicidal ideation. There's research on who has actually committed or taken any step, so an act towards suicide. And there's certainly research, and in some ways it's easier to compile some statistics on what we call completed suicides. In general, those show elevations across ideation, acts, and completion. There's a handful of studies that actually found that while the rate of completed suicides, and I think this was in college or adolescent age kids, was absolutely higher, they didn't find an increase in ideation or actions. That's just 1 or 2 studies, but it would fit into what I'm going to say later about impulsivity. So it's the final step, bringing them to the end. One other fact about terminology is far and away the standard term these days is completed suicide rather than successful suicide. Success implying that it's a good thing or a desirable thing. This is going to be highly controversial. I will just point out that we are inflicting our own value judgments by refusing to consider the term success. So I will put my caveat. I've worked with many suicidal patients across the years. I think to a person that those who were contemplating suicide were not, I will say, in their right mind. And most of them have substantially appreciated that they did not kill themselves in their moment of need. But I would say philosophically to me that one of the most fundamental rights people have is to decide whether they are alive or not alive. And there is a paternalistic and we know better than you angle towards deciding that everyone who kills himself is not in their right mind. So I'll just say that as an aside. The other thing I'll say is, particularly in the past, mixed in with ideation and particularly suicidal acts, there was confounding and confusion on what we now call parasuicidal actions. And those are actions such as cutting your arms, other ways of intentionally inflicting pain on yourself, where the intent is not to kill yourself. It's either to show others how much pain you're in, show yourself how much pain you're in, get in touch with some sense of reality or pain or feeling when you're numbed out. There's a host of different reasons, and most of the modern research tries to separate or differentiate intent to be dead versus parasuicidal behaviors. So one other thing, I mentioned that in some ways the statistics on completed suicides easier to attain than ideation or actions which require asking people and then to be candid and then to be able to remember accurately what they did or not. So two areas where our assessment of suicide or measuring it, completion is going to be impaired or measuring, particularly the relative risk of people with ADHD, is that still to this day, I would argue the epidemiologic evidence, the clinical evidence is pretty overwhelming. There are probably millions of adults with ADHD in this country who are still not diagnosed with ADHD. And what that means is if you are comparing those diagnosed with ADHD who kill themselves to everyone else, and that everyone else actually contains a substantial percentage of people with ADHD, that means the relative risk is going to be artificially lowered because you have missed numerous cases of people with ADHD. And particularly the older statistics, some of the studies that have just been published in recent years, we're looking at cohorts of the data was collected between 2000 and 2015, for example. There, I am sure they are underestimating or undercounting those who really have ADHD. The other way the statistics may be skewed, in particular in studies of ADHD and suicide, is that there may be deaths that were inaccurately assessed as suicide because of confusion about ADHD behavior. So I'll take, I hope it doesn't sound silly or flippant behavior. Let's say Freddie was walking across the Golden Gate Bridge with his friends and thought, hey, it would be cool to be climbing on the cables of the Golden Gate Bridge. He falls off, dies. Regardless of what his friends say or don't say about his state of mind, there's a high degree of likelihood his death gets calculated as a suicide. And there are suicide barriers on the Golden Gate Bridge now. So actions that many others would rate as so ridiculous, so daredevilish, so risk-taking that no one could have possibly done them without an intent to kill themselves may be missed. And again, that may skew the statistics one way, so it may overinflate suicide among the ADHD population, and it could work the other way as well. So that, for example, a number of single car accidents by some law enforcement authorities, so if you crash by yourself, if you're going 115 miles an hour and you crash on a section of highway where there isn't bad weather or other causes, in some jurisdictions, the assumption that probably was suicide. Well, it could be, but it could just be impulsive joy racing with someone with ADHD. So ADHD itself does introduce, more than for most other diagnostic categories, some degree of uncertainty as terms of the classification of deaths by suicide. Not clear that that has a major impact on the statistics, but I'm just throwing it out there. So a couple other things. One statistic that almost everyone not in the mental health field and many within the mental health field are shocked by is in the United States, and this has been true for decades, 80% of the deaths from suicide are men. I'll say that again. 80% of suicide are men. So we see newspaper article after newspaper article of teenagers or young women who are depressed, and we associate depression, weakness, women. Depression does occur in higher rates with women, and sort of assume that's who are killing themselves. Now, almost all studies suggest attempts at suicide and suicide ideation are substantially higher among women, but completed suicides, every age group, men, huge predomination. That also makes it difficult in terms of studies, whether looking at gender, ADHD, and suicide. So again, looking at the numbers overall, the majority of suicide deaths among those with ADHD are males. I mean, part of that is the majority of individuals with ADHD still seem to be males, whether is preponderant a sex ratio skewed males as we used to think? Probably not. Some of the data suggests that, again, even among those with ADHD who are at more risk of dying, and the evidence is pretty consistent, hyperactive ADHD puts you at more risk than inattentive. Again, that would skew itself towards males rather than females, at least by most data. So again, women with ADHD are at higher risk of suicide than women without ADHD. That's absolutely true. But men with ADHD are probably even at higher risk than women are, most of the data. Why are we seeing this strong association between ADHD and suicide? For years, there's been a fairly contentious debate with a big crowd saying, well, we know depression's more common if you have ADHD, anxiety is more common, substance abuse is more common, PTSD is more common. All this is this has nothing to do with ADHD. This is purely people with ADHD are more likely to have all these comorbid conditions, which increase risk. People with ADHD are more likely to have failures by traditional societal standards, whether it's not completing school, whether it's earning less money, or it's having relationships, divorces fall apart at a higher rate. So even if they're not clinically depressed, these people are more likely to have a sense of failure, a sense of loss, and are more likely to kill themselves. One other factor that's underlying some of the comorbidity between depression, between anxiety, between substance abuse, between PTSD and ADHD is genetics. We know there are strong genetic contributions to all of these. We know that the genetic contribution is polygenic, so lots of genes have tiny, tiny little effects. And so far, it looks like the majority of these common genes with tiny, tiny effects are increasing the risk for any one of these or multiple conditions, not just specific to one. So a one gene variant may increase your risk for depression, anxiety, substance abuse disorders, and ADHD. So again, that makes it hard to sort out, but there have been a few other confounding variables. Separate from diagnostic conditions, separate from genetic factors, there is the family environment. So not talking ADHD, just looking at early childhood trauma, whether you look at sexual abuse, whether you look at neglect, whether you just look at degree of chaos and disruption separate from overt abuse or neglect. All of those independently are risk factors for suicide later in life, and all of them add or compound to each other. So if you have multiple forms of abuse or neglect, that puts you at higher risk than just one of those. And what we know, and there are many loving, supportive, wonderful families, parents with ADHD raising kids in a healthy environment, but ADHD increases the likelihood that you will experience either ADHD in your parents or in yourself growing up, increases your risk of being abused, increases your risk of being neglected, increases your risk of family chaos. So that's another level of confounding. One other level of confounding, which I don't see written about too much, is sleep deprivation. We know sleep deprivation in and of itself is a risk factor for committing suicide. What is one of the mental health conditions most strongly associated with disrupted sleep? All of them have at least some correlation, but ADHD is way up there. And again, that's probably both a genetic predisposition. It's also pretty clearly tied into some of the aspects of ADHD behavior in terms of having greater difficulty pulling yourself away from distracting content and getting to bed on time. So all these are potential confounding factors. And I was talking about sort of social factors or social failure factors. There was a wonderful study on this horrible topic done in Sweden a few years ago, They had the whole Swedish population, 15 plus million people. And what they looked at was financial debt load and the risk of suicide. And what they found was that people with ADHD are running into more financial troubles, fairly early on in life. Troubles with money management is clearly a result of having trouble prioritizing, staying on track, a whole host of ADHD issues, making impulsive spending. So what they found is in the 3 years preceding suicide among those with ADHD, males particularly, there was a marked increase in the debt load. That doesn't mean everyone had debt, but it wasn't found in people without ADHD. So their conclusion was, again, this measure of failure and this feeling of being overwhelmed or lost or not being able to make it in society at the financial level seemed to be a fairly clear risk factor for those with ADHD in terms of killing themselves. So while we're talking about theories of why people kill themselves, probably the most established and widely used in research studies and formulations these days is called the three-step model by University of British Columbia psychologist David Klonsky. And he says there are 4 factors contributing to suicide, and he puts those 4 factors in 3 steps. The 4 factors he identifies are pain, hopelessness, connection, capability. Those are the 4 important, crucial factors predicting suicide, according to him. And there's some research to back this up. So the 3 steps are, the first step, hopelessness and suicidal thinking. So pain and hopelessness together are a risk factor. Second step is what may determine who goes further along that suicidal ideation path, and it's usually framed as a rescuing factor rather than a backwards, as a disconnectedness pushes people further along. But this is framed as connectedness rescues or buffers some people from feeling, and probably it's helping less with the pain, but helping more with the hopelessness that if others around you, if there's connectedness, that seems to mitigate the trajectory leading to suicide. And then he lumps the third, that capability, as those who are not supported and who have ideation, that if you have the disposition, if you have acquired factors, if you have practical contributors, personality issues, other diagnoses you may have, other conditions you're facing, like your financial debt, those are important in terms of whether someone's pushed over eventually to lead to a suicidal act. I think that's a useful model. I think it does fit for many of we can see why people with ADHD might be. They're more likely to feel pain, more likely to have physical accidents. They are more likely to have problems with physical health. They're also more likely to have psychic pain because, again, of more financial, academic, career failures according to society. And a sense of hopelessness, again, particularly actually having a diagnosis, knowing you have ADHD, knowing it is something intrinsically within you, has the potential in some people leading to, well, I'm doomed, I'm a failure, it's me, it's my brain, it's not just things happening to me. So that can contribute. There are good ways of hopefully addressing that. One would be increased in people with ADHD. We know, again, with levels of connectedness. On average, people with ADHD have fewer connections, last shorter durations of time. They may be less able to access them at times they need them. That increases your risk factor. And then dispositional. And here I would include, impulsivity. And my big claim or worry is that the impulsivity is sort of shunted into this minor factor. And I think it's actually more substantial than we're making it out to be. And we're neglecting it. So one of the interesting things in research on suicide is a major problem in America. The CDC just this past week released statistics. They're preliminary from 2022, but it's pretty clear that more people, and it was just short of 50,000 people, more people killed themselves last year than in any year in U.S. history. The rate is still a tiny bit lower than in 2019, but our population has grown since then a little bit. So suicide is important. It seems to be a growing problem. We don't seem to be doing enough to turn it around, despite lots of attention on despair, depression. And again, I think because we're omitting that impulsivity component. Why do I think that's important other than all my work with people with ADHD? One is, let's just look at what happened during COVID. At the beginning of COVID, mental health experts said, oh, we're going to see more depression. We're going to see more anxiety. We're going to see more substance abuse. We're going to see more domestic violence. We're going to see more suicide. All these things are, all those risk factors, all those comorbid factors for people killing themselves. What did we see? You saw substantial increases, depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance abuse, domestic violence, and a drop in suicide during the COVID pandemic. None of the experts were predicting it. I did. Why did I predict it? Is because all those stressors were going up. With those would make us think that suicide would go up. But with all the lockdowns intrinsically tied in with impulsivity, because I think some substantial fraction of the risk for suicidality is people making rash decisions in the moment without being able to see the whole picture clearly. And again, it's usually not framed as impulsivity, but sort of the best epidemiologic demographic study looking at what have we done anywhere in the world to substantially decrease suicide rates. It's in Great Britain. I might have the years a little bit wrong, but I think it was early 60s, Great Britain. So one of the most popular modes of killing yourself then was sticking your head in the oven. Adding the coal gas, which contained a substantial amount of carbon monoxide. Britain, over a very short span of time, switched from almost every house having coal gas to natural gas. Not that you can't kill yourself with natural gas, much harder to do so by sticking your head in the oven. And rates of suicide markedly dropped. Was that because everyone was happy to have an oven that was working on natural gas? No, it wasn't any change in depression, hopelessness, or pain. It was the readily available means of killing yourself. There's also a host of literature in the death by guns. Countries which have lots of guns and easy access to them kill more people. The data there is undeniable, even though gun rights, I'd say gun wrongs activists try to deny it or refute it. The data's there, and that's clear. Not the only factor, but it's there. I'll just bring a clinical vignette. And this was during COVID, but I had a patient with ADHD, not depressed, had a traumatic breakup with his boyfriend, and took a long walk in the city. Again, this was during the first 2 weeks of COVID when the city literally was shut down. It felt like a ghost, and it felt people were abandoning. So you could argue, Klonsky's 3-step. He had pain, he had hopelessness, he had lack of connectedness, and he felt intensely suicidal. He actually didn't act on it, but he was pretty close to it. It's pretty easy to imagine that would have been a death given slightly other factors. But I would argue strenuously, this person was not depressed. Again, depression requires pervasive, more days than not out of the last 2 weeks of being down and sad and a host of other feelings. This was impulsivity, and lots of work on particularly hyperactive people with ADHD, which come up much more quickly, much more powerfully. And I describe it most simply as what's in front of you becomes everything. So that's both intellectually, cognitively, attentionally, and emotionally, living-wise. So if you had some horrible tragedy, or maybe it's not even that big a loss, but with someone with ADHD, what's in front of you becomes everything. That makes you much more at risk of killing yourself. Tools to reduce impulsivity. So cognitive behavioral therapy, particularly dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, is really good at both helping people find different ways to be less reactive, to know that they have other alternative ways to behave and react. And particularly DBT has modules based on enhancing communication and connectivity to others. Psychoeducational. So I think reminding people, remind yourself you have ADHD. When you're really upset, remind yourself you are staring at the single tree in front of you. You are not seeing the forest. So tell yourself, I have ADHD. I need to step back. I need to force myself to look at the bigger picture. Other thing that there's good evidence for is Ritalin. So probably all stimulant medication, but it's most extensively studied in Ritalin. A recent meta-analysis described the evidence as robust. Again, ADHD increases your rate of killing yourself. Those who are on Ritalin have a marked decrease in that increased level of killing themselves. And in many cases, you're back at the background population level of killing yourself. Strattera doesn't, at least in a handful of studies, seem to have that protective effect. Much weaker data that other stimulants might. And then the last thing I'm going to throw out, and I should have emphasized it longer, in terms of the connectedness, in terms of helping reduce pain and hopelessness. For a year now in the US, we've had a nationwide hotline number. It's 988. You can call it. And the New York Times, about a month ago, reported on a survey done by NAMI, the National Association for the Mentally Ill. Less than 1 out of 6 Americans are aware of this 988 number. Part of it was almost intentional. The worry among the mental health experts was, we aren't ready yet to staff and man these lines. If we tell everyone it's there and we're not ready, we're going to be overwhelmed. But we've sort of underwhelmed right now. So lots of people aren't aware of it. And 2 important things I'd stress about this line. So this is an informational line. I mean, it is there and does have staffers, and it's staffed by a variety of different organizations depending on what part of the country. So the other sort of misconception that seems to be out there is if you call it, you're automatically dialed into the police department. You're going to send up people out to your house to bring you in or at least check on you to make sure whether you need to be brought in. So there is not this is an anonymous system. They do not have the capability to trace you. If you need immediately help, they will try everything they can to get you to tell where you are and to provide the help and make sure it gets to you. But this is not going to automatically trigger the SWAT team or anything else like that. And I do see some questions, so I will be jumping through them now. Dennis has another question. Do brain injuries during development increase the risk of ADHD? Any stage of life, and probably more importantly, early on in life, clearly more importantly, the greater the severity of head trauma, but heads are less protected when you don't have a fully formed, foamy skull around it and don't have stronger neck muscles and other things. I think it's highly likely. I just am not familiar with the data about whether during delivery, head trauma damages to the brain there, whether we have good research on the risk to ADHD. My recollection is we have some, but I don't know. And I know even less if we have any hard data on physical trauma in utero during pregnancy and whether that's correlated with ADHD. Again, I think that would be a lot of confounding factors. ADHD for mothers is a risk factor for being in abusive relationships. Again, clearly not the majority of people with ADHD. Stay healthy, stay happy.